Hello and welcome to the LRG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen McGrath, Head of Public Affairs, and Dennis Hall, LRG Bulletin Editor.
Hello, everyone.
In a week where the government is challenging the demand by the COVID inquiry to see the former PM's WhatsApp messages, Lord Goldsmith resigns as minister, and Tory ministers raise eyebrows at the appointment of Sue Gray, how are the public feeling about politics in Westminster? Dennis.
Well, Helen, a new report suggests that Britain's trust in politics has fallen significantly since COVID. A leading think tank finds just 6% have full trust in our political system, and most people support constitutional reform. Here's the backstory. The British public's trust in the political system has fallen significantly since the pandemic, potentially as a result of recent political scandals, according to a report from a leading think tank. Just 6% of the public have full trust in the current political system, while 89% support constitutional reform, the report found. The survey of 8,000 people conducted for the Institute for Public Policy Research highlights support for democratic reform is strongest in the UK's former industrial heartlands, including the Red Wall constituencies. The data shows more than 90% of people in the former Labour safe seat of Burnley support democratic and constitutional reform. Harry Quilter-Pinner, the Director of Research and Engagement at the IPPR and one of the authors of the report, said, "People are still very much in favour of democracy as the best form of government, but in practice they find our politics are lacking. They find that our politics basically fails to live up to those principles of democracy." He added, "Trust in politics is low and has declined quite significantly since COVID-19, potentially as a result of some of the ongoing political scandals we've seen in politics. People feel that politics and Parliament fail to represent them properly and deliver on the promises that politicians make at election time." The survey shows that only 1 in 3 trust Parliament to fulfil its core function of acting in the best interests of the electorate across the UK, and subsequently, an overwhelming majority support reform. Of those surveyed, 31% said the current system needed completely reforming, 26% backed reform to a large extent, and a further 32% favoured some reform. And only 6% of the 8,000 people surveyed said the system did not need change. Quilter-Pinner said, "Democratic disengagement and disenfranchisement of the current political system is strongly correlated to things like income and education. So people with lower levels of income and low levels of education are less satisfied with our democracy, and they are more supportive of democratic reform." We also found a geographical variation, he said, where some parts of the country are particularly likely to support democratic reform, and those include former industrial heartlands, including former vulnerable seats, and also places like Wales, and those places further from Westminster.
Now reported in the Local Government Lawyer, an overview of the legal outcomes of deprivation of liberty applications found that children subject to DOLs are subject to, quote, severe restrictions on their liberty for significant periods of time. This is the report of the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, which examined 113 cases of children subject to applications over an 8-week period. The report found that the type of restrictions on children's liberty authorised by the National Dole Court were severe, stating that each child was subject to an average of 6 different types of restrictions, including in almost all cases, 99% in fact, of constant supervision, often by multiple adults. Restraint was allowed in over 2/3 of cases, and restrictions were rarely relaxed over the study period. The NFJO noted that this calls into question the purpose of dole orders to facilitate meaningful change in children's circumstance and a long-term outcome. The study found that in the majority of the 113 cases, the application for a dole order was granted, and that further, and hugely concerning, 53.8% of children were placed in at least one unregistered placement during the study. It's worth noting here that whilst intended as a last resort measure, in respect of applications via the High Court under inherent jurisdiction in England, there was a 462% increase in deprivation of liberty applications between 2017-18 and 2020-21. Lisa Harker, director at Nuffield FJO, said in respect of those statistics that the level of trauma and adversity that these children have experienced is deeply distressing. They have often been badly let down by the adults around them. It is obvious to all that they need intensive, stable, consistent care provided by highly experienced professionals. Yet the study confirms that due to a dire national shortage of provision, this last resort measure is being used to deprive children of their liberty to try to keep them safe in the absence of the intensive care they so clearly need. Dennis.
Well, my next story is about the last elections. The Electoral Commission has produced its first, albeit interim, analysis of the last elections and the impact of the introduction of voter ID. Here's the detail. Interim analysis from the Electoral Commission has found that at least 14,000 people who tried to vote at a polling station in May 2023 were not able to do so because of the new voter ID requirement. The analysis from the Commission also showed that around 4% of all non-voters the Commission surveyed said they did not vote because of the voter ID requirement, and that just 25,000 people used voter authority certificates. It added there is evidence that some people found it harder than others to show accepted voter ID, including disabled people and the unemployed. The Commission stated that 87% of people in England, excluding London where there were no elections, were aware before polling day that they needed to show voter ID to vote. But awareness varied across the population and was lowest among younger age groups, Black and minority ethnic communities, and those who said they never vote in local elections. Awareness was significantly lower among people who said that they did not have an accepted form of ID, compared with those who did have ID. Approximately 89,500 people applied for a voting certificate before the deadline on the 25th of April, but only around 25,000 certificates were used as a form of ID on the 4th of May, the Commission said. The Commission added that these figures are low when compared with estimates of the number of voters who might not have any other accepted ID. The Commission said there are several areas where further analysis is necessary to establish a clearer and fuller picture, and these are highlighted throughout the report. It will publish a full report on the May 2023 elections in September. Now, despite the preliminary nature of the analysis, the Commission did make a recommendation for the government to ensure that returning officers are able to collect and report monitoring data on the impact of voter ID in future elections. It also said that work is needed to improve the quality and reliability of data collected at polling stations in future.
Now, last week, the UK government was criticised by the Climate Change Committee for its slow progress on climate action and its support for new oil, coal and airport expansion plans. The CCC expressed concern that the UK is losing its leadership on climate issues and is unlikely to reach its targets for cutting carbon emissions. The committee specifically criticised the government's approval of a new deep coal mine and plans for a major new oil field. The UK has legally binding targets to cut greenhouse gas emissions to meet net zero by 2050. But the CCC warned that delays in policy development and implementation are making it increasingly challenging to reach these targets. The government defended its actions, stating that it has met all its carbon targets to date and will continue to rely on oil and gas for power generation in the foreseeable future. Critics argue that the government's climate failures are putting the country's international reputation and influence on climate at risk. The CCC called for more action to encourage the installation of heat pumps, a reduction of meat consumption, and the planting of trees. It also criticised plans for airport expansion and called for a focus on reducing air travel instead. Dennis, what's your last item for this edition?
We've covered the topic of artificial intelligence before, from the perspective of its impact on legal roles and the legal responsibilities that it implies for organisations. But now there is a new concern, that its development has become a free-for-all, with no system of regulation in place to meet competing interests and challenges that will inevitably occur. Here's more on this. The Law Society has said that the government should ensure that its pro-innovation approach to regulating artificial intelligence systems should not diverge from the EU's nascent regulatory regime. In its response to a consultation on the government's AI regulation white paper, Chancery Lane also calls attention to the urgent need for explicit regulations about liability across the life cycle of an AI-based system. Concerns about the regulation of AI technology have rocketed up the political agenda since the emergence of so-called large language model systems, such as ChatGPT, which can apparently mimic human intelligence. Last month, the Prime Minister said he wants Britain to become a global centre for AI under safe and secure rules. Meanwhile, the EU is in the process of drawing up an Artificial Intelligence Act designed to ensure that AI developed and used in Europe is fully in line with EU rights and values. Now, in its 48-page response to a white paper published in March by the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, the Society calls for a nuanced, balanced approach to regulation, with a blend of adaptable regulation and firm legislation. Areas that require strong regulation include the issue of liability. Meanwhile, the Society argues that current routes for contestability and redress for AI-related harms are not adequate, mainly due to the lack of clear definitions in the current legal framework for terms such as meaningful human intervention. Entities above a certain size or working in high-risk areas should be required to appoint an AI officer, it states. And other recommendations cover the need for organisations to be transparent in their use of AI. A particular concern is the government's use of AI-based systems to make life-changing decisions. The Society say, we propose that the government mandates comprehensive AI transparency across government and public services, ensuring that every citizen is aware of when and how decisions affecting them are made or informed by AI systems. Overall, the response calls on the government to ensure alignment with the EU while maintaining the UK's attractiveness for investment and innovation. Now, commentators are unanimous on this issue. The absence of any plan from government for regulation of AI activity is very concerning and is in no one's interests. After all, innovation without good governance may lead to chaos.
Well, AI will definitely be featuring at our governance conference in November, as there is much to talk about. Planning now. A High Court judge has dismissed a wide-ranging challenge against a decision by the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy to grant development consent for the construction, operation, maintenance and decommissioning of the Sizewell C nuclear power station in Suffolk. One central point of background is that the order was made before a permanent supply of potable water was identified for the generating station. Now, this is the case of Together Against Sizewell Limited and Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, EWHC. And the judge held as follows. The court is faced with a similar situation to that which arose in the Heathrow litigation, where, having heard full submissions in a rolled-up hearing, in that case dealing with 5 different claims, it had to decide whether permission to apply for judicial review should be granted on each ground. In the present case, as in Spurrier, the mere fact that the court has had to consider in a rolled-up hearing and in a judgment a substantial amount of material and legal submissions does not mean that the grounds raised passed the threshold for arguability. Going on, the application for permission to apply for judicial review is dismissed. Each of the claimant's 7 grounds failed, however. They do provide useful summaries of existing case law. And on that note, you can read more on the items discussed today and many more besides by going to bulletin number 25, available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too.
Have a good week, everyone.